You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, I sat down with my old comrade, John Amble, who now runs editorial at the Modern War Institute and helped me start War on the Rocks. We spoke about urban warfare and the role of technology in warfare in the context of Hamas's horrific attack on Israel and what seems to be the Israeli response against Gaza that is shaping up. Enjoy the show. So, John, you've spent quite a few years looking at the issue of urban warfare, and particularly the challenges it might pose to the U.S. military in the future. But one of those cases that I know you looked very closely at is that of Israel. Can we start by just talking about how you came across the topic, both as a practitioner and a scholar, and your experience researching this in Israel particularly?
It's always been something that's interested me. My first deployment as an Army officer was to Baghdad in 2008 as a trained military intelligence officer. It was kind of a fundamentally unique environment to be in, because what I learned as a lieutenant, as an MI officer, was you're sort of doing all this work, intelligence preparation of the battlefield or the battle space. You're doing military decision-making, mission analysis stuff. That's all sort of this, it felt at the time, a bit archaic battles on open ground and the inviolability of the 3-to-1 offense to defense ratio as a planning consideration, things like that. And then I landed in Iraq and we were in Baghdad, and I spent 12 months never leaving the city limits of Baghdad. And it struck me as a pretty unique sort of space to always be surrounded by buildings, to always be on roadways, to have this density of infrastructure and people and both combatants and non-combatants and important political symbols and religious symbols. And all of this stuff is so densely packed together that it creates a number of challenges for military forces operating there. Fast forward a number of years, and I was working at MWI, and we published a few articles on urban warfare and the unique challenges that this particular type of environment poses to military forces. And one of the things that
really launched a big program of research for you and for others as
well. It did, and it was because there was an appetite for it. Nobody really, particularly within the Army, owned this problem set of urban warfare, and we realized that people were interested in it, and so we pretty shortly afterwards created something called the Urban Warfare Project, which just to give a home to, a place for people to talk about and think about this kind of stuff. It's been going strong for 6 years now at MWI. And
John Spencer has, of course, played a big role in that.
John Spencer, yeah, one of the foremost experts, if not the foremost expert within the sort of Army network on the subject of urban warfare and the unique challenges it poses.
And you went to Israel on some research trips, is that right?
Yep, I've been to Israel for a few times. Once was actually with a working group that was coordinated by Daphne Rishmon Barak at IDC Herzliya, who does some really fascinating work and wrote a book about subterranean warfare specifically, which is obviously an important component of urban warfare, given the fact that, we talk about, I think in the Army generally, we're used to looking at maps and thinking about things in 2 dimensions, operations in 2 dimensions. But you go into a city and there's this third Z-axis, this other dimension, and subterranean is obviously an important component of that. So we did some work there. On another trip, we went down to Elim, which is in southern Israel. Honestly, probably the best military urban warfare training site in the world. It's fantastic, and got to spend some time there watching how the IDF trains for urban warfare.
So we'll talk a bit later in the episode about what's happened already and the relationship between that and how we view technology and warfare. But for now, I want to focus on what might happen next. Israel has just formed a unity government. It has mobilized over 300,000 reservists, although that process has not been without its problems. It seems like they're going to send possibly as many as 100,000 soldiers into Gaza, which is a heavily urban, not fully urban, but almost entirely urban environment. Israel's trained for this. You mentioned this facility is this big state-of-the-art urban warfare training center. Do you think this is a type of campaign that the IDF is uniquely trained to execute as a result of that? Or do you think they're going to run into major roadblocks that they haven't even considered, even in these training environments?
So yes, to both. I think the IDF is uniquely equipped for urban operations because Israel's a small country with a finite number of defense planning scenarios that they need to worry about. It's very different from what we in the United States think about, where with the global force, with the global presence, needing to be prepared for a full spectrum of contingencies, the IDF trains for a small number, relatively comparatively smaller number of types of operations. One of the big ones, given the fact that Gaza is as heavily urbanized as you said, is urban operations. Now, the second part of your question, will they potentially be surprised by the challenges that they encounter there? The answer is almost certainly yes. You mentioned that 300,000 reservists have been mobilized. In 2014, Israel mobilized 75,000, 1/4 as many. That was the last time they sent ground forces into Gaza, 3 full combat divisions. I don't want to necessarily prognosticate about exactly what it would look like, but I think the writing is on the wall that they are planning something even larger at this point, given the scale of the suffering that Israel has suffered, the deadliest day that they've had in decades. I think, there is an impetus now to say, we want to do something once and for all. I don't think they're going to be able to do this, but they want to do something once and for all to completely destroy Hamas' military capability to launch rocket attacks into Israel.
I've been thinking a lot about how this is different from what we saw in Mosul when U.S. forces with our Iraqi partners ousted ISIS from that city. And that was an operation where the preparation for the battlefield, it took place over months rather than what we're seeing right now, which is likely to be more like weeks or even days. I know this is a campaign that you've studied very closely. So can you talk a bit about this and if you think this is a fruitful comparison?
I think it's a very good comparison. There are certain phenomena that are common to effectively all urban battles, if not across history, at least across modern history. But there are others that are particularly relevant. Mosul is one of them, in part because the population density of Mosul is very similar to what it is in Gaza. As you mentioned, the coalition forces' approach to Mosul, along with their Iraqi counterparts, was very slow and very deliberate. It was the final in a series of urban battles to seize back control of Fallujah, then Ramadi, then Mosul, also Tikrit in there. It was a months-long planning process, and yet it still took 100,000 Iraqi security forces months to finally clear Mosul. I think that it would be a bit foolish to think that you could clear an area of Gaza in a much shorter period of time. That being said, Israel's not trying to clear Gaza. They're trying to eliminate Hamas military capability there.
It's similar, though, in that ISIS was governing Mosul, although for a much shorter period of time, it should be said. Hamas has been governing Gaza for almost 20 years. I think 17 years or something like that. So there's similarities and differences.
The time that was spent on planning the final assault on Mosul and the final operation in Mosul gave ISIS fighters time to prepare their defenses. Hamas has already also had that time. We just didn't know it. Hamas knew that they were going to launch this. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that it was launched 50 years after the Yom Kippur War began. It was, it's symbolic. They knew this was going to happen and when it was going to happen. It would be
I don't think they anticipated it was going to be so, looking purely at in a tactical sense, so successful.
I agree with you. But they knew it was going to happen, and it would be foolish to think that they didn't anticipate reprisals from the IDF. And so in all likelihood, they have been preparing defensive positions, strong points. In 2014, there were miles and miles of tunnels. I believe it was in 2020, the last time there was a sort of anti-tunnel operation conducted. And it was something like 60 miles worth of tunnels that was identified at the time. It's probably more at this point. There is virtually another city below the streets of Gaza. That's going to play a huge role in enabling defenders to move between strong points and to put up a stiff and probably pretty effective defense.
You and I both did our master's degrees. We're going back many years now, but at King's, adjacent years. But I remember this was when, for me, it was 2008-9. This is when these Israeli ideas about, I'm just thinking about this for the first time in years, about applying literary theory and all these different things to war, about the space on the battlefield. But this is really early thinking about urban warfare based on the Israeli experience back then. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
I do, yeah.
I can't remember the colonel's name. The Israeli colonel was the big thinker on this. But this is first when it was starting to get popularized. But I think like a lot of things where the Israelis are sort of assumed to be the experts, counterterrorism, now urban operations, it ends up running against the same old strategic problems. What are you actually trying to accomplish? What can you reasonably accomplish? Can you actually crush and destroy Hamas? Can you eliminate such an insurgent, a governing insurgent, not even an insurgent, from an urban environment like this? And over what timeline?
Yeah, you said we were both at King's in adjacent years. We were also both in Afghanistan at the same time. So you and I probably both are pretty familiar with with the notion that you can have an eminently capable tactical force that still struggles to achieve enduring political or strategic outcomes. The IDF could be the best urban warfare fighting force in the world. That doesn't necessarily mean that that will translate to what, on a policy level,
could be considered a victory.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart statement. A sad statement, but a smart statement.
We published an article at the Modern War Institute in the wake of this, when it looked like Israeli forces are likely to enter Gaza, kind of identifying some of the specific challenges, some of which are, again, phenomena that are common across urban warfare battles in recent history, at least, and others that are a little bit unique to Gaza. Those are, number one...
Who wrote the article?
John Spencer, our chair of urban warfare studies. But we've got a number of them. I mentioned one of them, tunnels. That sort of third dimension, instead of just an x-axis and y-axis, which we're all very comfortable. Military forces are very comfortable planning by looking at a map and saying we want to go from here to here, and this is what we're going to do en route. This is what we're going to do to get there. This is our task and our purpose. When you add that z-axis, it complicates things, and doesn't just complicate things by 50% more because now you have a 50% more axes to worry about. It's fighting on multiple planes where...
Yeah, it's exponential almost.
Where you have visible and invisible firing points and strong points and sniper positions in tunnels and rooftops and obscured inside buildings. And you have defensive positions that involves mouse holing, where they can move. You're in the street, which is a very vulnerable place to be. And the defending forces are moving between buildings through mouse holes that they've knocked between buildings or knocked in walls between buildings that allows them to move completely covered and concealed from the offensive forces. So you're going to see a lot of that. Anti-armor weapons. Hamas is very well stocked with a range of anti-armor weapons, some old and probably only moderately effective against the advanced tanks that Israel will send in if they do, assuming they do, and they should. You can't enter Gaza without tanks and other armored vehicles. Some of them rather advanced, from Russian stockpiles, from Iranian stockpiles, from a number of different places. So you're going to see anti-armor weaponry that is going to be a major challenge to overcome. The only way to do that is to effectively use combined arms at the tactical level. You can't send tanks unprotected by infantry. You need to include engineers to be able to breach obstacles, and you have to do this all together. Israel is pretty good at that, but you slip up once and it makes these armored vehicles, which are such an asset, a huge vulnerability.
Hi, this is Ryan. I'm interrupting my own podcast to tell you a bit about our membership program, War on the Rocks Platinum. There's been some big changes. We introduced new features. Let me just tell you some of the new stuff that we've added. We've added Thinking the Unthinkable, a new members-only podcast with Ankit Panda about nuclear issues. We've added a newsletter called The Adversarial, which offers short expert analysis about America's top adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and jihadist groups. And we have a new newsletter called Rewind and Reconnoiter, where we take authors who have written for us more than a year ago and we ask them to revisit the issues they wrote about for us. This winter, we are also going to be launching some new podcasts, including one called Not the AI You're Looking For on Artificial Intelligence and National Security, as well as podcasts focused on each of the 5 military services and a cyber newsletter. So if I was you, I'd sign up now, become a member, and support what we are doing. Back to my conversation with John. One of the things that we're likely to see, and we're already seeing, understandably so, rightfully so, is a lot of questions over whether Israel will adhere to laws of war or international humanitarian law. Can you go through some of the challenges of doing this in an urban warfare environment?
Yeah, I mean, there's no place where it's more difficult. There just isn't. The sheer number of civilians on the battlefield. One of the advantages that often you have is the ability to clear a city before you go into it. This is one of the lessons that we had that the U.S. Army learned in the first and second battles of Fallujah. The first battle of Fallujah, there was not a real comprehensive effort to clear the city of non-combatants. The second battle there was. There's a reason why the first battle was not overly successful and the second battle was. We had effectively
You think that was the big difference?
It's a huge difference. That and the fact that we aligned more forces, the right type of forces. We did a better job of isolating the city with blocking forces all around it so that AQI fighters could not leave, insurgents could not leave, but also could not be reinforced from outside. There are a lot of things that we did better the second time around, the second battle of Fallujah, but one of them was you cleared the city. It's just a really difficult thing when there's a crowd of people, when one of every 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 people that you see is an enemy fighter versus when it's most of them are enemy fighters. It just makes it a much easier task.
And there's real questions about just even the basic feasibility of doing this here. So
you can't do it. Where do the residents of Gaza go?
So Israel is trying to direct civilians to a certain part of Gaza, from what I understand, but it's not like they can leave. Egypt, I mean, some people have been asking, why doesn't Egypt just open their side of the border? Because Egypt does border on Gaza. The Egyptian authorities, of course, aren't going to do that. I mean, that would cause them all sorts of problems as well. So whether it's right or wrong, which is not unimportant, but they're just not going to do it. That really makes that impossible, nearly so.
Israel does know that the world is watching them to slip up and not to do something that is not in accordance with the laws of armed conflict or international humanitarian law.
Well, the way that they're talking about this war already sounds like they're less interested in adhering to those, with the total blockade of fuel, electricity, food. The way that they're talking about bombing.
I think if you go back to September and October 2001 in this country, you'd hear a lot of rhetoric too that sounded a little bit less sensitive to those issues, and I think that that's a natural human thing.
No, I think that's a really apt comparison, is asking what you think Israel should do strategically from over here in the U.S. is much easier than forging a path forward in Israel that speaks to the political realities, the traumas that this population has been through both most recently and historically. And so it is sort of like asking the United States to be more restrained in the direct aftermath of September 11th.
It is very much like that. Now, again, because this has been kind of a long and enduring problem that this is an inflection point in, it's a particularly severe inflection point, a particularly tragic and difficult inflection point from an Israeli point of view, certainly. But this isn't the first time Israel has had to do something while being aware that the eyes of the world are on it to look for it to slip up. A lot of people that want it to slip up and to do things that are not, again, in accordance with international law. They have developed tactics that are unique to Israel that nobody else has done. They have something called roof knocking, which is essentially dropping either an inert bomb or a very low-yield explosive that is not going to destroy a building on the rooftop of a building, to get the people inside who may not have responded to a radio broadcast or a leaflet drop or something like this to say, hey, we're not safe here. We're going to go someplace else if you want to target a place. And look, this is a huge challenge with them. Hamas is, pretty cynically uses the residents of Gaza as human shields. They're not stupid. They put their rocket firing points and they put weapons caches very near the residents of Gaza.
The Palestinian militant strategy for the armed opposition of the Palestinian national movement since the beginning has been to provoke disproportionate responses from Israel that will bring suffering upon the Palestinian population, to mobilize more Palestinians in favor of the armed opposition cause. So this is a part of the game. And I would argue, actually, Israel has been terrible at navigating this. Israel plays that game, not to their own advantage in many ways. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between technology and war in the context of what Israel was preparing for. We were having a very interesting conversation that I made you cut short before we started recording because I wanted to save the good stuff for the mic, on the Iron Dome and how Israel was envisioning a war that might break out versus the one that actually broke out. Can you dig into that?
My first point is, I actually think that the Israel Defense Forces are one of the best militaries in the world at sort of combining this reliance on high technology and at the same time acknowledging that war is fundamentally a pretty brutal thing that involves soldiers on the ground engaging one another, often from fairly close quarters, and, to put it indelicately, killing more of them than they can kill of you. Israel understands that while also embracing high technology. Now, that's not the case of all military forces. There are some militaries who are a bit biased, I would say, against technology. And it's something that I've thought a lot about. And the conversation that we started to have before we were recording was...
And this is another place where you have a unique point of view, I think, because you've worked with Futures Command. And can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Army Futures Command is, I think, one of the most important. It was the largest reorganization that the Army had had in decades. I think it's the most important reorganization. I think it was timely and really meaningful that there was institutional effort put behind creating this entity to really think, not just think deeply about what the requirements would be of what the battlefield would require in the future, but how do we actually get there as well? And it's not only about technologies and how to incorporate AI and unmanned technologies and robotics and all sorts of things, but also, across what in the Army we call the .mil PF spectrum, how doctrine needs to change, how we need to organize differently, how we need to train differently, how we need to manage personnel differently, all of these different things. Army Futures Command is engaging on that, and that's really, really important. From a purely technical perspective, I'm a bit of a skeptic about anything that smacks a bit of the idea that technology will solve war, quote unquote, solve war, that will make it more antiseptic, that will remove the really difficult and frankly bloody parts of war.
And the decisions associated with that.
Exactly. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that technology, if you look throughout history, we've looked at new technologies and they have had a major impact on the conduct of war. They have often given a decisive advantage to another force. When they have, it's been very ephemeral. It's been short-lived.
Also, it's worth unpacking that not in ways that make war cleaner.
No.
If you look at from the machine gun to the nuclear bomb, these aren't things that make war less horrific. They're actually things that make warfare more horrific.
I mean, World War I is the obvious example of a war that people thought was going to go one way and went a very different way, a much bloodier way because of the introduction of these new technologies, not only the machine gun, but chemical weapons and a whole host of things. But I am skeptical of this idea that technology holds answers that frankly probably doesn't. And when I saw Saturday morning when I woke up and I saw what was happening in Israel, and I saw specifically, I looked at how Iron Dome was performing. Iron Dome is one of the most advanced and interconnected air defense systems in the world. It is. It's not just believed to be. It is, and yet dozens and dozens of rockets were not intercepted by Iron Dome, but also landed in populated areas and produced.
The system was overwhelmed.
It was overwhelmed, and that's exactly the thing. The first Iron Dome battery was deployed in 2011. Between 2011 and 2014, by that time, I think there were 4 batteries. Don't quote me on that. The highest number of rockets that Hamas was able to launch from Gaza over a 24-hour period was 312. There was anywhere between 192 and 312 were the high points during that 3-year period.
And these were often literally rockets made from lampposts. These were not sophisticated as they are now, much more sophisticated.
Even still, Hamas rocketry is notoriously imprecise. But it was, a few hundred at most. Fast forward several years, and they reached a new sort of high point of 470 rockets in a 24-hour period. On Saturday, in the first 20 minutes of that barrage, they launched somewhere between 2,200 and upwards of 3,000 rockets. That's not only 5 or 6 times more, but it happened in 1/172nd the amount of time that it took them to launch 470 rockets. Now, that's a pretty crude adaptation, but it's a sensible adaptation. If you understand how Iron Dome works, how there are 10 batteries, what they do, you just overload the system. And I think there was, not just on the Israeli point of view, anybody who saw in Iron Dome an effective, not foolproof, but almost foolproof system of air defense, and overlook the idea that the more metal you fling at it, the less effective it's going to be, kind of, I think, is guilty of a failure of imagination.
Yes, and that's exactly what Bruce Hoffman said. I don't know if you got a chance to listen to the show I recorded with him this week, and I'll repeat a point I made on that episode, is not only was Hamas overwhelming the ability of the Iron Dome and associated Israeli systems to process what was happening and much less stop those missiles, but also physically, and we've also seen some evidence of some interesting cyber attacks that are traced back to anonymous IP addresses in Sudan, physically dismantling the command and control network and ISR network that Israel had along the border.
I don't know enough about it to be able to speak authoritatively on what exactly happened, but there are certainly indications that there was jamming, that there were operations in the electromagnetic spectrum. These are just not things that we normally, at least in most mainstream discussions about Hamas, that we normally associate with the group. We associate suicide bombings and rocket attacks and things of this nature. And Israel has sort of optimized its defense against those things very, very well. And if you think about, the Iron Dome in 2023 is not the same Iron Dome battery was deployed in 2011. It has been updated. If you think in terms of sort of tactical adaptation, if Hamas introduces slightly better rockets, the the Israel will respond in kind with Iron Dome. It will, if it introduces, attacks with greater quantities of rockets, Israel will respond in kind. You'll have more batteries fielded. You'll have improvements in ammunition reloading time, larger stockpiles of ammunition, better electronic systems that are better able to trace the trajectories of these and make better decisions about whether or not it should engage an incoming rocket or not, because Iron Dome does not engage rockets whose trajectories are not predicted to impact in populated areas. If it's a series of kind of, in this article that I had just written with the director of the Modern Warfare, Colonel Pat Sullivan, we talked about the distinction between evolutionary adaptation, a few more rockets, a little bit better rockets, and revolutionary adaptation. Now, revolutionary adaptation might be associated with the things that we think about when we talk about revolutions in military affairs, a giant leap forward in technology. It might also be something as simple as, let's launch a bunch more rockets, and that works.
And as in all things war, the political context is super important and can't be divorced from the technological. So what I have in mind here is, because of the course that Israeli politics has taken over the last year since Netanyahu got reelected, most of the IDF's operational battalions were deployed in the West Bank, including battalions charged with the security of the border along Gaza. And this political context is really important to remember. And this is why I think the attack was much more successful for Hamas even than they anticipated. And it makes me think this is 3 times in the last 10 years that a major armed Islamist group has shocked the world. ISIS with the seizure of Mosul and other cities as well. Taliban, of course, seizing Afghanistan much more quickly than even they anticipated, including the capital, Kabul. And now this attack on southern Israel.
3 times in the past decade, we have seen Islamist groups achieve operational, if not strategic, surprise on a pretty grand scale, a headline-grabbing scale. And I think that that's really important for, again, from a U.S. perspective, with a joint force that has sort of been in this period now for years of pivoting from low-intensity conflict, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, stability operations, these things, to what do we talk about now? Preparedness for large-scale combat operations against a peer and near-peer adversary. This is the coin of the realm, in a sense. I think, every time something like this happens, you kind of wonder, it raises questions about what a modern military force needs to be equipped to be able to confront. And I think Hamas is actually a bit of an outlier amongst those, because all 3 of them, ISIS was a terrorist group that fought like an army. This was now General Bob Work, who was Colonel Bob Work, commanded the 2nd Brigade, 82nd Airborne Division during the Battle of Mosul. That was one of his main points that I think was really important. This was a non-state actor that fought like an army. So ISIS they fought like a conventional military, even if they were certainly a non-state actor, even if they would disagree with that categorization. I still remember, and you and I maybe talked about it, when in 2014, when they made this sort of lightning advance on a series of Iraqi cities and were seizing territory, they were taking over Iraqi army Humvees. Well, where did the Iraqi army get them from? They got them from us. And I kept wondering, every time I saw a news clip on this, I wondered if one of those was one of my Humvees from when I was in Iraq. But they fought like a conventional military. The Taliban too, when they entered Kabul, even in the back of pickup trucks. If that's not mobile light infantry, I don't know what is. They were moving around in squad-sized elements. But Hamas is even a step further. Hamas is the governing authority in Gaza, the way they're organized, and because of their history, they're an Islamist group, and that's the sort of political motivations they have that underwrite the violence that they engage in. But the methods of that violence is a much larger mix of sort of classical, I guess what we would consider classical terrorism, and conventional military operations, which I think, coming back full circle to what the IDF are going to encounter, is they're going to encounter units that are units of Hamas fighters that are operating in a coordinated and effective fashion.
Yes, I agree with everything you said. And also, I believe current reports are that Israel has recovered 1,500 bodies of Hamas attackers. So let's assume they haven't recovered all the bodies yet, and that some managed to exfiltrate back to Gaza. We're talking about a brigade-sized attack in U.S. military organizational terms, something approaching that. which speaks to your point, I think.
And a highly conventional one, a highly conventional combined arms attack that included indirect fire, light infantry, motorized infantry. I mean,
Amphibious.
drones. So they're the best form of air power that they could manage. It included that. You're right, amphibious operations. It's not a suicide bomber blowing himself up, and that's it. It's a lot more than that. And I think that's also, again, indicative of what IDF forces are going to encounter in a pretty stiff defense of Gaza.
Well, John, it's great to have you back on the show that you helped start many, many years ago.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the War on the Rocks podcast. Do not forget to check out War on the Rocks Platinum at warontherocks.com/membership. And stay safe and stay healthy.